Thank you very much, Joy, and I was absolutely thrilled to hear Philip opening this conference with his very moving presentation. I have the honor of representing here IPES-Food, the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, a group of 25 experts from different parts of the world, coming from different disciplines, whose assignment is to work in three directions. First, to adopt a food systems approach to reforming how we produce and consume food. Secondly, to work in a transdisciplinary way, using not only scientific academic expertise, but also the knowledge of food systems actors, hybridizing the two sources of knowledge and expertise. And thirdly, working on issues of power in food systems, adopting a political economy approach to food systems reform. Our diagnosis is that we are faced with a very inert system that we may describe as the industrial food economy, relying on farm workers being paid low wages, farmers receiving low prices for their produce, compensated in rich countries by the important subsidies that they receive, all this to encourage large-scale industrial farming in the form of monocultures with heavy mechanization, using the techniques now known as the Green Revolution technologies developed in Europe and the US and Canada since the 1930s, and that have expanded through Latin America and Asia in the 50s and 60s. And that type of farming also relies on inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, without those inputs being internalized really in the costs of food production and reflected in the prices consumers pay. The impacts we know are at least three levels. We have major environmental impacts from these industrial farming methods, the loss of biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, and Philip Limbury recalled some of the figures we have here, and of course important damages to soil health and the ability for soils to function as carbon sinks. We also have significant health impacts. This industrialized farming has resulted in diets shifting to more heavily processed foods with a greater role of animal proteins in our diets. And this is making populations sick, particularly low-income groups within these populations, and I will revert to that topic in a minute. And thirdly, finally, we have social impacts from this industrial farming system that has been shaped by our policies. Many small farms are disappearing at a very rapid pace because they simply cannot achieve the economies of scale. They cannot be competitive in this capital-intensive way of farming. This has all been done in the name of mass production to satisfy the needs of mass consumption. It has been done in the name of producing as much as possible in order to keep the prices low for everyone, including low-income households, to be able to feed themselves. But in fact, this is failing. And there are a number of social inequities that result from the industrial farming systems that have developed, and I would like to list 5 major such inequities. First, we have witnessed in recent years record high food prices. This is not because we are not producing enough. It's not a problem of a mismatch between supply and demand. It is the result of food production that is heavily dependent on the use of fossil energy. The merger between food markets and energy markets leads to increased volatility on food markets and to the prices of food going up when the prices of gas and oil go up. It's also the result of the financialization of agricultural systems and and markets, itself the result also of this merger between the energy and food markets. Secondly, we have major agri-food corporations that are making huge profits from this situation. They include the hedge funds and investment funds that speculate on the volatile prices of food commodities, but they also include the big retailers, the big food processing companies, and the major traders. Thirdly, we have globally hunger that is increasing. For many years, we were relatively optimistic that global hunger would be receding as a result of the technological progresses of the Green Revolution. These hopes have now disappeared. The number of hungry people has been increasing over the past 3 or 4 years, and that is largely because the countries in which these populations live have been forced to invest in cash crops for exports, not producing sweet potatoes, sorghum, millet to feed local populations, but producing cotton, coffee, cocoa, rubber, tobacco, in order to reimburse a debt that is in dollars or in euros, and of course, requiring them to produce for global markets to reach the high-value markets of OECD countries. So these countries have underinvested in local food production to satisfy the needs of the local populations, and they have sought to develop export-led agriculture that is marginalizing small-scale farmers, that is marginalizing local food systems, and that results in a handful of producers controlling land and water resources in those countries to satisfy our needs of rich consumers in rich countries. That is the major reason why hunger is still present and in fact is increasing in recent years in the global south. In rich countries, and that is the fourth inequity, we have a growing number of households who are unable to feed themselves decently, who are forced to consume junk food and rely on processed foods because healthy eating is becoming too expensive for them, because they cannot sacrifice on the costs of housing, mobility, or even healthcare, and therefore when they do not have enough money, they sacrifice on food, and they are the first victims, therefore, of obesity and associated non-communicable diseases, such as type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, or certain types of gastrointestinal cancers. These are the populations impacted by food poverty, and they exist even in wealthy cities such as this one in London. Fifth and finally, the result of these developments is that people are turning against the attempts by governments to control how food is produced, to impose restrictions on which pesticides are used and whether biodiversity is protected in the way we develop our food production methods. And the recent elections in the Netherlands, where a populist party has been gaining almost 1/5 of the votes in the Netherlands based on a platform against environmental regulations imposed on farmers, shows the danger of consumers being led to believe that the solution is big food in order to reduce prices and to ensure that there will be no scarcity looming at the expense of the attempts of governments to regulate farming. So this is the situation we have, and these are the inequities we face. Now, within IPES-Food, we see one major reason for these inequities not being addressed in increased concentration in food systems. First of all, the international division of labor has been deepening so that we depend more and more on a small number of countries for the production of the major crops on which we depend. Production is increasingly centralized in a handful of countries on which we depend. And when certain geopolitical events occur, when global supply chains are disrupted from these countries, the whole system is therefore impacted. We also have a system that is increasingly taking the form of an hourglass shape, if you wish, in which we have, of course, a large number of small producers, a very large number of consumers, and in the middle, a small number of actors who control food systems. 4 major grain traders control some 80% of the trade in cereals: Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, Louis Dreyfus. You might add Glencore if you want the 5 major grain traders. And these companies are taking food systems hostage to their thirst for profit. We have seed and chemical firms that are monopolizing the markets with mergers that have developed over the past 10 years that are very significant. The merger between DuPont and Dow Chemicals, the buying of Syngenta by Chemchina, or the acquisition of Monsanto by Bayer in 2016. And the problem is not only increased concentration, it is also that now the seeds that are developed, the plant varieties that are developed, are those that will respond to the agrochemicals that these very same firms produce. So this merger between the seeds and the agrochemicals industry is a source of concern. And finally, yes, we rely on a very small range of staple crops: wheat, soybean, corn for the most part, and we should not be fooled, therefore, by the apparent diversity of the foods on the shelves of supermarkets. So we need to change this, and I agree that change is on its way. Philip Limbury very eloquently described why this was not only desirable, but even, let us be optimistic, unavoidable. The question being, will it be done fast enough? We believe that for change to occur, 4 conditions should be met. First, we should listen to the farmers and work with them to identify the solutions that they can be part of. And let us never forget, they are the first victims of a system that makes them sick, exposing them to diseases resulting from using pesticides and agrochemicals. They are the first victims of price volatility and of the oligopolistic and monopsonistic positions of the big buyers. So we need to involve them in searching for solutions. Secondly, we need to address food poverty not by food aid, not by charity, but by strengthening social protection and improving wages so that people do not have to make food choices based on what is cheapest. Thirdly, we have to address the power of the big agri-food corporations, and competition policy, antitrust legislation is an important ally in this respect, provided competition policies are not simply geared towards consumer welfare and keeping the prices low, but rather also protect the sellers from the monopsonies and the oligopsonies of the big buyers and ensure that farmers receive a decent remuneration for their work. Fourth and finally, we need to address the situation of countries in the global south who've been forced to allow the perpetuation of colonial patterns of domination in which they produce the raw materials that we then process and sell back to them in the form of finished food products because they have a huge debt to reimburse. And the situation, of course, is becoming worse today, with 60% of low-income countries who are facing unsustainable levels of debt, 30% of middle-income countries facing this situation, forcing them into this lock-in that they urgently must now get rid of. So I would like to really thank Compassion in World Farming for co-organizing this conference with IPES-Food and for involving us in this very important discussion as to how our food systems can evolve. And let us take solace in the fact that given that the crises are multifold, environmental, health, social crises, new alliances can be forged, new alliances can be built between animal welfare activists, people working on the defense of small-scale farmers and on South-North relations, environmental NGOs, anti-poverty groups. Together, we can win this fight. Many thanks.